Hey guys, welcome back. Today on the show we have David Esker, a physicist who has devoted his life's work to a compelling theory about how the dinosaurs were able to become so large. This is a question that's plagued me since I was a little kid, and I've never come across any satisfying explanations. David Esker has been on my interview bucket list for years, and I am so excited to have him on the show today. We are exploring the entire history of the planet, the solar system, and how to really fit in the incongruent pieces of the puzzle to a narrative that is more streamlined, simplistic, and ultimately more satisfying. And so I don't know if he's right or not, but it's a pretty cool story, and I think it's one you guys are going to really love.
Tell us what you think in the comments. Come to our Demystify Sci Facebook group. Tell your friends. If you have already done all of those things and you are searching for ways that you can help the podcast, feel free to sign up for our Patreon at patreon.com/demystifysci. Every time that somebody signs up, it is a huge event for us. Number one, it means that we have somebody else who can help us steer the ship, because this is very much a collaborative project. We don't want to be at the helm of this mysterious, silent group. We want to know what you're curious about. We want to know the theories that you're interested in. We want to know the topics that you'd like us to cover. And when you join the Patreon, you get to participate in that on a weekly basis, because we get together once a week and we have a really, really solid, amazing group of people who show up week to week to week. Shout outs to Neil, to Oliver, to Steve, to Mike, to Milos. Like, every single week we have this group of people that are just so curious about the world, and it's the absolute highlight of my week to just be able to talk with people who are listening, because otherwise it's kind of like talking into the void.
And we don't have time to be out there on the internet exploring all these theories 100%, right? And so the more people that can come into this, committee, and the more that we can reach our tentacles out into the world, that can be you, and you can really help us out. So consider joining up for the smallest amount of contribution that you can even give. And also all that money is going back into the show, and we're going to keep cranking up the quality and the features, and we're going to make this a real awesome project going forward. I mean, hopefully it already is, but I think it's going to just keep getting better. So anyways, enjoy this conversation. It is absolutely mind-bending, and we'll see you all next time.
The scientific revolution starts now.
Demystify Sci Podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
We found out about you because we were genuinely just trying to figure out how dinosaurs, why they were so big, and what happened. This seems to be a very unique period in the history of life on Earth, where you have these enormous creatures that seem to contradict everything that we understand about physics, right? They just don't make sense.
But somebody the other day told us that by the end of the dinosaur period, and I don't know how accurate this is because I didn't look it up, that the dinosaurs had gotten so big that scientists think that they weren't actually able to care for their young anymore.
It was too energy expensive or something, and that's part of why they died out. But I mean, that's beyond, why they died out is a whole other.
Well, no, what I'm just saying is that they're so big that it defies belief.
It does in so many ways, right? When I found your blog, it was incredible because it laid out a number of things that were cloudy in my mind as well, and you addressed them and said that there's a solution, actually. And the solution that you propose, the thick atmosphere solution, is something we've explored on the show before. We actually had an astronaut, a former, he's an on-duty astronaut who came on, and he was working with Levenspiel and had a similar idea for, albeit a little more conservative version of how these flying, I don't know, they're not really dinosaurs, I don't know what you want to call
Pteranodons,
them. Pteranodons, yeah. How they were able to fly. But it essentially was a thick atmosphere solution as well. And then, we've been entertaining it in terms of planetary evolution ideas. And so, yeah, I just wanted to set the context for how we found out about you. But how did you get into this?
Oh, okay.
That goes back to the kite ideal, but okay. So when I was a kid, I'm listening to the local rock and roll radio station. They're going to have a kite festival. I decided to make a kite for this festival, and I was going to have a simple plan of just having a regular diamond-shaped kite that was popular back then, and make it 3 times bigger. And so I made, 3 times taller, 3 times wider. That comes out to be 9 times more area. And then I went to make the cross pieces on it. Well, 3 times taller, 3 times wider, 3 times deeper. That makes it 27 times more volume, or more mass, more weight. And suddenly I realized that by making it 3 times bigger, I had increased the ratio to be 3 times more. That is, there's 27 times more weight with 9 times more area. So I wondered if my kite was going to fly. And so at that young age, I had discovered the square cube law. And the square cube law is what explains why size matters.
Mm.
Okay.
So the thing just wasn't struck. It was like the cross beams were breaking, or what was happening?
Yeah, that was a problem. But I was wondering whether I should make my cross beams skinnier,
I see.
Or thicker, or what? How should I address that? But yeah, that was a bit of a problem. But it still flew. But the point is, it made me realize. I'm like going, oh my gosh, this is a really important scientific concept.
Yeah, can you explain that for people really quickly? I mean, it's not really taught in the American school system, and it's
exactly.
It's so foundational. It's like the Pythagorean theorem or something. It's absolutely at the heart of everything.
It's incredibly fundamental to science. I've even made the statement that science is hardly science without it, because it affects physics, biology, geology, astronomy, everything, all the major sciences. They should have something about this at the beginning of every textbook and explain it, that how size matters and affects the properties.
So can you break that down, the square cube relationship for us?
Okay, well, when the square, if you have a multiplier, as I did with the kite being 3, all your areas are going to be, length times width, or 3 squared. Your multiplier squared gives all your areas. Whereas all your volumes are going to be length times width times depth, or 3, in this case, 3 times 3 times 3, or your multiplier cubed, hence the name square cube law. And what it means is that the properties of not just something that's dimensionally squared, but everything, their properties are different based upon the size of the object.
And this turns out to really matter for biology and astrophysics, because heat is generated and mass is a product of volume, whereas the surface area, the ability to radiate that heat away, right, is a product of the surface area. And so you have a mismatch here where as you enlarge something, you're generating tons of heat and you have a lot of mass, but you have a decreasing proportion of area to radiate away that heat. And so you run into trouble with big things overheating and little things freezing, something like that.
Exactly. So you have that in engineering. You also have that in biology. Say you have a mouse and an elephant at the 2 extremes. The mouse is like, it's constantly doing everything it can to keep from losing heat, and the elephant is overheating. So, and that's just one of the properties. This heat issue you bring up is just one of the consequences of this. One of the properties that are changing because of size. You have this structural thing too, that as animals get larger, they have a more difficult time supporting themselves. So larger animals are more likely to break their bones where smaller animals are not. People freak out about a cat being up in the tree. it's going to fall, whatever, and hurt itself. That cat is in no harm, or is no, it's perfectly fine. It can fall from a tree, and it's not going to get hurt. Oh.
And so the way that area plays into that, for people, just to clarify, is you have, in order to support a structure as it becomes more massive, you need more cross-sectional area in the supports, the legs, let's say, right? Mm-hmm. And so you would expect that something that's really big and heavy would have these enormous, like, tree trunk legs, essentially, that would be necessary to support it. But what's interesting is that the dinosaurs don't seem to have outrageously disproportionate legs that would be necessary to support this kind of weight. Is there a way that people explain this away? I couldn't find one, but is there a way that people in the past have traditionally been like, well, their legs were made out of adamantium or something? Like, how did they pull it off? Is there an explanation that's out there? Other than
you mean dinosaurs specifically, or do you mean square cube long?
Sorry, I was talking about dinosaurs in particular. Like, I'm always just trying to see how the standard explanation covers these ideas, or is it just ignored, or is there some standard explanation for how that's possible that's different from yours?
Well, I don't know how much you're aware of this, but there's a kind of a rule in science that if scientists can't figure out something works, they generally don't talk about it.
It's kind of true.
And so the vast majority of people have never heard about the square cube law, even though Galileo was the first one that talked about it in depth. In fact, here he wrote this, Dogs Concerning Two New Sciences, and about first 2/3, 3/4 of the book is about the square cube law. He doesn't specifically directly say square cube law, but that's clearly what he's talking about, and that's why he wrote the book. Pretty obvious. So it's there, and this is just one of the two major books that Galileo wrote. The other one was about the planets, solar system, and all. And yet this one, while that one kicked off a huge scientific revolution, this one here, the science community has done everything it can to ignore it. So.
Yeah, it's really surprising because my advisor in grad school is from Turkey, and he was like, "This is stuff we teach in like kindergarten in Turkey." Like the square cube law was not surprising, to him at all, and he was kind of perplexed that the American school system hadn't, embraced it as a foundational idea.
Well, here's the problem. The only time they bring it into that I know of, that when they bring into teach it in grade school. In high school, say, is to explain how or why cells divide. Because as you said, it gets more difficult. The cells become less efficient as they become larger because of the square cube law, and so they need to divide to maintain their efficiency. But they like bring it in the back door, talk about it, and then forget about it. When actually the square cube law should be, you look through a biology textbook and it comes up constantly. And there's just so much understanding that's missed because people don't know that size matters.
So in terms of the size mattering, and in terms of the dinosaurs being large, and there's being this limiting relationship between surface area and volume, that relationship should be maintained even as you go back in time. And so if you have a limit to the size of an animal based off of radiative ability per unit of volume, then you would expect that relationship to hold as you traveled back in time. But the dinosaurs seem to be too big to have that relationship hold. So what was different about the environment that allowed for such a massive shift in the ratio between the square cube law in present day animals versus in the dinosaurs?
Yeah. Well, that's how, the thick atmosphere.
So why does the thick atmosphere...
Fundamentally, I think what we're trying to clarify, just for people listening, is on the table is the concept that buoyancy, which is an upward force due to density separation under gravity, was opposing the gravitational stresses such that you didn't actually need that additional cross-sectional area on the load of the animals.
So in this case, is the temperature radiation a red herring?
If you don't mind, could I just slow you guys down just a little bit?
Yeah, of course.
Because, I wish that people could just take in the square cube law first, understand how fundamental that is, and really let that sink in, and how badly the fact that we're leaving that out of science before we go on to the next stage, and next stage, and next stage, because I think there's a danger in going through all this stuff too fast, and it just doesn't really sink in that people understand how big a deal this is.
It is a huge deal. I think that the heat thing plays out more in terms of astrophysics, right? And I think that's a really interesting, I don't want to say blind spot. I'm sure people are thinking about it, but it's certainly important.
I mean, I feel like it's important on the level of all other mathematical laws of nature, right? Like E equals mc squared, or F is equal to whatever. I don't remember the gravitational equation off the top of my head, but like these are fundamental laws that describe nature. And so the square cube law is one of those that lives in the pantheon, but in and of itself, it's a relationship that has to be considered in context of phenomena in order to grasp its importance. And so I think that, David, you're right that in biology it's often brought up because my background is in biology, and that's exactly the way that I know the relationship, that cells have to divide because they get to be too big for their surface area. And in terms of physics, it seems like astrophysics and kind of body plan limitations are its domain. What are the other ways in which you think it's so vital for people to grasp it? Because it's a pretty straightforward relationship, right? Like you can summarize it in a sentence, and so now somebody walks away with it in their mind, out into the world. How does the world change for them?
It's amazing. I did the analogy. It's like going from watching black and white TV to suddenly it's being color, because you just look at everything and all of a sudden you look at it and say, oh, I know what you're doing. I understand you. You can look at an ant and see how fast it's moving its legs, and faster. Well, you can't see it. It's moving too fast. You wonder, how does an ant go and move its legs so fast? Well, if you understand how science is, it makes sense. Because I was once at a conference.
Wait, explain that one about the ants. How does it make sense?
Well,
yeah, break it down.
Well, they live at a very fast pace of life. The smaller the animal is, because you have the electron impulse, the sensory, traveling back and forth between their leg and their brain. That's going to travel much faster. It's a much shorter distance traveling back and forth to them. So they've moved all their legs several times before you even notice that they're even moving. You can't keep up. Whale is going to be at the opposite end. It has a long distance. There's just so many things about the square cube law that it's amazing. It really would be good to let sink in. Getting back to your statement before, if you're asking, well, why isn't it taught here in America? I would think that among the few grade school teachers that even find out about it, square cube law, and learn, oh my gosh, Galileo promoted this and so forth. If they even discover that, if they were to start teaching that, well, it won't be long before one of their kids are going to say, well, what about the dinosaurs? And now you got a grade school teachers that are trying to do the right thing, and who now is totally embarrassed because she or he can't answer that question. And you can see why they wouldn't want to keep teaching it.
Yeah, there is a lot of There is a lot of personal dynamics that are at play in science that we often don't understand when we look at the history of science. We don't understand how important it is to learn how to work with others, really. You know, I have students all the time ask me, like, I want to be a great scientist one day. What's the most important thing? Like, somebody literally came up to me after lecture the other day and was like, he's like, oh, you went to Columbia for your PhD and stuff. Like, what's the most important thing to succeed in science? And I was like, you need to learn how to play with other people really well. That's what it all comes down to. It's like, if you can't do that, if you can't make coalitions, if you can't find means of being a fun person to work with, you're dead in the water. It's like, there's such a human element to this that goes far beyond just having a good idea or being able to do a good experiment even.
I mean, we met a lot of people along the way that were not fun to work with, but still had a lot of power. How do you account for that?
I mean, I think you can only go so far, honestly. Like, I don't know, the best
I'm
best
thinking
people,
about
right?
somebody who was on your floor. You had 2 labs on your floor, right? And so, like, one lab was along the paradigm of, like, play well with others. And the other lab, I don't think that was the case.
I mean, I would say that a tyranny is short-term successful, but it's not really a sustainable model that's going to lead to a lot of creative output, right?
Wasn't
He might
that
be able.
guy at, like, the end of his career and, like, really well respected?
He had worked on one tiny little problem, incrementally advanced it by brutalizing people, fast turnover, nightmares.
So that's a model that does work. It just it's an exceptional. It's not.
I think it works in this incremental way, right?
Yeah.
But I don't think that it's going to allow you. Like, look, if you want to make a huge paradigm shift, if you want to actually have a discovery and really change the way people see things, you're in a different game than if you're like, well, I'm in this lab that's published in this one high-ranking journal for years and years and years, and we do the same thing, and we just update it a little bit every year. That's a very different scenario than if you're actually hoping, as many grad students are when they show up, that they're going to have a groundbreaking, paradigm-shifting discovery, right? That's what people dream of. Every single person in our class was like, hell-bent on, I'm going to get a Nobel Prize. And Anastasia and I are just sitting there like, whoa, really?
Okay.
We're like, man, I'm just here to like see how this works. So
You should tell them about me and give them a warning. That's not what they should be doing.
I mean, I think that people participate in science because they want to move the human project forward. And we have a very particular way in which we reward people for moving that project forward, and that's a Nobel Prize, right? That's the highest honor that you can get. That's like a Heisman Trophy for whatever sport Heisman Trophies are for. Right? Or I don't know, is it like soccer or something?
American.
Well,
I see.
the two of you earlier said something about the edge of science and how to move science forward. And there's, if you're at the edge of science, that is, you have the latest technology, you're a PhD, and you somehow finagle yourself to get the latest technology, or get to some exotic location, you're digging up the whatever, and you get the best telescope, then you're publishing something. There you are at the frontier of science. But I have to emphasize something here. What I did is not at the edge of science. This is something, in fact, all these things is where science said, okay, we got an answer, and then they moved on. And I'm going, no, guys, you got the wrong answer.
It's more like at the basement of science. It's more at the heart of things.
Well, it's at the foundation. Yeah, I mean,
Foundation.
like, I think that there's 2 edges of science, right? If you take it to be a body of knowledge that has a vertical orientation, there's what's called in rock climbing the edge of the rope that you tie into, that you take up with you up the cliff, is called the sharp end. And so the sharp end of science is the ones that are people that are using the James Webb Space Telescope, people who are at CERN. These are the people that have all of the technology, and they're climbing.
The other end of the rope is called the anchor.
And the other end of the rope is called the anchor. And so
And so you're moving the anchor end around, basically.
Is that true?
Yeah.
Interesting.
I suppose that's one way to look at it. I have another way of. I think of it more as a foundational thing, where I'm presenting evidence, and as opposed to people at the frontier of science, many times people say something, they've made some huge discovery, on and on, and it turns out, well, they misinterpret the evidence. And where other times you have someone that does that, and you don't know you don't know unless you're specifically in that field, you don't know who's right, and you have to give it a little time for it to sort itself out. This isn't like that. I'm here at the more foundation of science, and you guys can go with your rope climbing analogy. I like to look at it as like a board puzzle, and people are out there on the edge of the puzzle, and this is an interior piece that they can't find, and I'm saying here I've got this missing piece, and when you go that route, what the problem is, I'm telling all these people that they're wrong, and I've got all kinds of evidence that's been gathered up showing that they're wrong, but now we're into this massive group of people in this groupthink that are refusing to budge.
So let's talk about the evidence, because I think that this is going to help people to sort of to sink into the idea, because that's kind of what makes or breaks a theory. Like we've had people on the show that like to talk about expanding Earth, which is that the Earth used to be smaller and then it got bigger. And I think that what makes or breaks that theory is evidence for the proposed mechanism. And so if you have a mechanism that makes sense and you have good evidence, it's easier to take the idea than if the evidence is all over the place. So let's talk.
Yeah, let's prosecute it like a trial. Let's lay out the evidence on the table, and then let's prosecute the theory after that.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, let's go at it. All right, so let's have the evidence. All right, so when I finally got back to looking at this after while I was teaching, and I finally said to myself, well, I'm going to look and see if I can figure out this problem of how the dinosaurs grew so large. My first hunch was like, well, maybe the Earth was spinning faster. Well, that didn't pan out. And then I came across this idea that, okay, well, if the atmosphere was thicker, it would provide a buoyancy force. And my first instinct was that's preposterous. This has no chance of working.
Hold on one second. I want to that's a really interesting idea, the spinning thing too, before we move on from that, because I've heard this in the context of other theories too, but I don't think people realize it, but there actually is a force opposing gravity due to the fact that we are on a planet that's spinning. And people probably aren't aware of that. And so the idea is if it was spinning faster, like a centrifuge, you would lessen the weight on these animals, something like that, which I think is actually pretty clever. But there's ways of, how do people know how fast the Earth was spinning back then?
Geologists record, I think they look at silt on tidal silt, I think is what is it, and they're able to get it under a microscope and count it. And it's kind of tedious work, but I think that maybe that they come up a day or two because it is kind of hard to make sure. But
these are called the rocks are called tidal rhythmites because they encode within them the tidal intervals. And there is I want to say that it was a paper from the 70s, like it was in 76 or something, which is the sort of the quintessential paper that went through the rhythmite data from, I think they had something that was like 260 million years ago and 50 million years ago, and then they compared them and they were like, they're the same. So there's This
is inseparable from lunar dynamics, as I understand it, right? Like they're not seeing solar tidal effects versus lunar tidal effects or anything like that.
He reported both.
Lunar and solar.
Well, that's the tides, right? The tides are a product of the pole of the moon, but they're also a product of the pole of the sun, right?
Yes, the moon is like twice as strong in its gravitational pull than what the sun is.
So the rotation or the orbital period of the moon is also a factor in terms of estimating.
And there is some, like, so what you can say is you can say that, okay, so the rhythmites are consistent across these two separated time periods, but it could be that you have, I think what you're saying is that you have a shift in the dynamics of Earth spin versus moon spin. And
Distance of the moon too, right? There's all these things at play. Like, I think I don't want to totally derail this. It's something that it bothers me a lot. I spend a lot of time thinking about these rhythmites and thinking about the dynamics of this system because we're also trying to make statements about the diameter of the Earth, and ultimately the clocking of that has a lot to do with where the moon is. And so if we have the assumption that like the moon's orbit was exactly the same, then that's consistent, but also things could change, like exactly what you're saying, the spin rate or something. And then if the moon was at a different distance, then that would also produce a continuous record. So,
but it creates a very difficult computational problem, right? Where in order to be, like, there's just so little data about the deep past in terms of these tidal dynamics that it's hard to say anything with certainty. And unless you're going to reanalyze all the evidence from scratch,
you just end up making a lot of assumptions. Like the moon dynamics are essentially the same, the distance is more or less the same, and that's that.
Yeah, guys, could I jump in here?
Yeah, of course.
Get
it. The moon is moving away from the Earth. Okay. First lunar mission, they put mirrors up on the moon, and they documented the fact that it moves away about 3.2 centimeters per year or something. And there's a reason why it moves away from the Earth, because there's tidal forces it creates. Myself and another physics instructor was talking about this at the time. We're scratching our heads when we first heard about that. How could that happen? Well, it's conservation momentum. So the moon has been moving away from the Earth for a while. And so the farther it moves away, the greater its period. So it does change, as you're saying. It also very much affects how much tidal forces it has on the Earth. And so tidal forces in the past were much stronger than what they are now. And it's the day was like 23 during the time of the dinosaurs. It was like 23 and a half hours instead of 24 hours.
Mm-hmm.
So the rotation of the Earth is slowing down. Okay, so yeah, if there's a dinosaur that's on the equator, yeah, that dinosaur might feel a little bit lighter by so many pounds, but it's not anything that's going to make a difference.
I guess all I'm saying, and I don't really mean to derail everything about this, is I just want to be clear that what I'm saying is that assumes a certain kind of uniformitarianism about the way that the moon has been receding, and there is a slight possibility that there was more of a stepwise transition and that we're not looking at this slow recession, that there was events at which the moon was commensurate, right? If you're talking about the actual radius of the Earth, if the Earth is decompressing or whatever, you can get confused about those things because you make the assumption that the rate of recession has been the same all of these years, but you really don't have that many data points to say that.
There needs to be more, about the data points. It's easy to look at the physics of what's happening and draw upon solid physics concepts like conservation momentum and so forth to see the general things of what's going on. It'd be nice to go and get more data points to see what the agreement is between the theory and the actual evidence. But I think we could all agree here that the rotation of the Earth, it's slowing down. The moon is moving away, and bottom line, as far as the dinosaurs go, this is not a solution.
Yeah. That's what's critical. Yeah, it didn't work out for you. You were like, this is not a tenable explanation. So you moved on to buoyancy.
yeah, when you look at what is a possible solution for how the dinosaurs grew larger, there's really not a whole lot of options to look at and still be scientifically sound. I mean, you guys are going on to this expanding Earth thing, and it's like, wow, why don't we just throw the textbooks out? I mean, and start over, because that's pretty extreme. So
we can get into the weeds about that later if you want, but I think it's actually commensurate with your explanation. But it's not some idea of like mass addition or anything. We're actually playing with decompression dynamics of elastic materials and stuff like that. But anyways, we can get back to that later. That's a fun topic. But I want to hear your ideas first.
Okay, thank you. Well, like when I first came across it, I'm like thinking, well, this has no chance of working, and for two reasons. First, I was saying, well, how would it be possible? I mean, that's the first question. It's like you're going to have this incredible amount of pressure on the Earth's surface, and would that even be possible? Okay, and then the other thing that occurred to me instantly, like, well, if the Earth's atmosphere was so much thicker than the Mesozoic, well, wouldn't there be all these other scientific paradoxes spread out among a few science disciplines that this would have been discovered a long time ago? And so it's like, when I first started, it's kind of like I wasn't real thrilled about investigating this hunch, and thinking it's going to fail right away, and yet the opposite happened. I kept on investigating all these different ideas. Say, for example, well, about there being other scientific paradoxes in these other science disciplines, and lo and behold, yes, there were.
Can you elaborate on some of those?
Okay, well, it's not just paleontology. Okay, with the terrestrial animals of the dinosaurs and the flying ability of pterosaurs. There's also the fact that there's no ice in the polar regions. Okay, and that just another thing that it just isn't common knowledge among most people, even scientists, that throughout the Mesozoic there was no ice.
I think that might be changing. There was a PopSci headline literally yesterday about warm Antarctica and mammals moving into the poles.
What now?
Well, there was a PopSci headline. Yeah.
Mammals are much later in this story.
I guess that's true. That's true.
So I mean, I think what you're referring to is just that most people, this is a real tragedy. There's so much nomenclature disasters in science, but one of them is that we both use the term ice age in science to refer to this period of glaciation and interglaciation, but in pop parlance, ice age just means the last glaciation period. And so this is really, really confusing. But what you're saying is during the Paleozoic, there was no ice age proper. There was none of this period of glaciation, interglaciation.
There's no ice at the poles, at the South and North Pole. There wasn't ice on the top of the mountains.
For millions of years, for millions and millions of years.
For millions of years. We're talking a couple 100 million years. And not only that, there's evidence of the dinosaurs being up and other creatures being up in the polar regions. And at first, the paleontologists were thinking, well, they must have migrated. And no, there's also evidence of plant life that shows that they're the type of plants that could not survive cold environments. So beyond doubt, during the Mesozoic, the polar regions were very warm. And so that's, how do we explain that? Okay, and paleoclimatologists, they can't. So that's one of those again, another one of those skeletons in the closet that scientists don't want to talk about that's going on.
Yet at the same time, it's kind of foundational to the concepts of continental drift or plate tectonics that these fossil seams were continuous across different continental boundaries, and the shifting of these perhaps. When I read about why there were plants in the Antarctic, people are like, well, the plates are moving around and things were different back then. And so
exactly, if you don't want to accept the evidence, you can go that route, but they've already accounted for that. The continents are moving around, but the geologists have already determined that no, the continents were up in the polar regions, and we have these fossils showing that it was warm there and no evidence of ice. So it's, it is what it is. And so that's one of the bits of evidence that indicates that
but something was really different, right? Something was really different.
Yeah, something was definitely different.
And so you're kind of drawing a line here between overall climate and this gets into your mechanism later. I want to hold off on that for a second, but the way that the climate was also being reinforced by the thick atmosphere paradigm, essentially.
Yeah, there's this interaction between the life that exists within a certain climate and what climate and how the life itself affects the climate. So it's there's a whole lot of stuff in science that they're completely missing on. So they go through all the things that as far as the major paradoxes are. There's the size of the dinosaurs. There's the pterosaurs that were huge. These are reptiles, and there's no way in the world that they should have been flying. There's the shape of the dinosaurs. If we're going to talk about how theory of evolution and the theory of the thick atmosphere, they work together here, because with theory of evolution, you shouldn't just have animals have a certain shape or characteristics for no reasons. Now, sometimes it's hard to figure that out, because sometimes there might be, a male might have certain features just because it wants to attract a female or something. So sometimes it can be confusing, but pretty much most all the dinosaurs had a specific shape, and that was they had much stronger rear legs than forelegs. And not just that, while the paleontologists have been wondering, well, why aren't we seeing any of these dinosaurs dragging their tails behind them? And they come up and say, well, how is it, could they have a real muscular tail? Well, it must have been for counterbalance or something. No, you can't have a real muscular tail. Muscles have to get some sort of exercise. They'd be ideal for, tails are generally, as far as creatures go, they're used for moving through a fluid. If you have a strong muscular tail, so think like a crocodile or an alligator. It's got a very powerful tail, and when it pounces on its prey that's coming up to the water, that's its tail, and it's very powerful in driving it forward. So
it's really funny, because when we put this idea in front of Don Petit, the astronaut, he was like, well, they were just in shallow tidal areas. He's like, they were just floating essentially, but not in such a thick atmosphere, but they just lived in water or something like that.
There's unfortunately what you see in science quite often is they keep going back to you'll have an ideal that gets floated. And sorry about that. And then they show the evidence of why it doesn't work, and then a few decades go by and it comes up again, especially if they haven't yet figured out the answer. And this is one of those. Brian Ford, he's upset the paleontologist, because he's gone back. He's a biologist, microbiologist, I believe, that's come back to this idea of the dinosaurs living in the water. And the paleontologists are saying, no, we took care of that. Yeah, 7 years ago or something. That was the big thing. We thought that the big sauropods used to soak in the water like hippopotamus, and that's how they support themselves. But no, we that's no good. Okay. And so, yeah, you might think, well, maybe this big tail on these dinosaurs, maybe that was used for helping it swim through a pond or something. But no, these dinosaurs, the paleontologists are right about this. They were truly terrestrial animals. Okay. And so they were using that tail.
What's the evidence for them being terrestrial animals? mean, certainly some of them must have existed in water. I think some of those brachiosaurs had like nostrils on top of their head or something like that. But in terms of like the terrestrial dinosaurs, like, I mean, I guess they find the nests of them. They got their footprints, all of that stuff. That just made me think of an experiment, actually. Like, is there a way to assess a footprint to get information about the amount of pressure that was being exerted by that animal?
Oh my. Yeah. I've seen that too, where someone says, well, let's figure out from the footprint how heavy the animal is. And I've gone out to sites and like alongside of a say what used to be an ocean or lake or whatever, where the dinosaurs there walking around, and really how big that impression is primarily determined on how soggy is that ground.
I see.
When the impression was made. And so that's really just not a good way to try to determine the weight of an animal.
I only ask because it seems like pressure is essentially an impossible thing to detect. Like, we can see the composition of the atmosphere, but if the partial pressures are essentially still the same, but the overall pressure is different, it's very hard to find a readout for that.
Oh, that's true. I mean, there's nothing in geology that records pressure, really. The rocks themselves get buried deeply. They're under tremendous pressure. And you have these different types of rocks. You have the sedimentary rocks, the
igneous and metamorphic.
Igneous rocks and the metamorphic rocks. And the metamorphic rocks are the rocks that have been deeply buried, and so they go through a chemical change. Well, they're deeply buried. So you can't get a pressure reading on that on the atmosphere from the rocks, because they're well overridden by the pressures that they receive from themselves being buried and unburied.
We spoke to someone the other day, and I think it may have been De Hilster, who was talking about sand dune heights, where the sand dunes are sedimentary rocks. And so if you find traces of really, really tall sand dunes, like taller than we would have today, then that could be maybe used as a proxy measurement, because the gravity, a change in apparent gravity would allow you to have a taller sand dune, because each individual grain is experiencing less pull towards the ground. And I'd never heard that before. Yeah.
I mean, we need like with all of these, we need some sort of smoking gun eventually, right? I feel like the person that brings this into mainstream attention will have something like that to point at, you know? It's so hard to move a paradigm based on the same evidence that your contenders are also using, right? That's the tricky part.
I'm not sure when you say that the main is my contenders.
Just this. There's an established paradigm for what the Earth looked like 60 million years ago, and it's not too different from what it looks like right now in terms of the atmospheric composition or the effective gravity or something like that. So I'm not criticizing you at all. I'm really just saying that it's something that I spend a lot of time thinking about, and we're always trying to dream up some sort of proxy measurement for pressure in the distant past. You know, I haven't given up hope that we'll think of something. That's all.
I'm trying to find some indication of like the tallest fossilized sand dunes. So far, I have found that there's sand dunes in Chile that are thought to be 4,000 feet tall, but those are present day. So let me keep looking.
So, anyways, back to your pool of evidence here, and then maybe we can prosecute the mechanism a bit.
Well, I've gotten to a point where I feel like the thick atmosphere theory is similar to like the theory of evolution. It's like I've hit this thing home so many times where this is really the only reasonable explanation that I really don't even need to go any farther, but maybe I will. And for your, I'll just throw this challenge out to you since you brought that up about, well, is there some sort of test or something? Well, I don't know, it was a few years back, someone came to me and said, well, about the meteorites that hit the Earth. Well, if it's going through a thick atmosphere, they would burn up more than if they're going through a thin atmosphere. All right. And we haven't yet got to this yet, but part of this is where I talk about how it's thicker during the Mesozoic time, the time of the dinosaurs, but actually before that and after that up to now, it's thinner. Okay, so it's gone through some changes. And so you should be able to plot the meteor impacts over time, and in that way determine whether the atmosphere is thicker and thinner. Well, this person went off and they published what they did. I would actually review their paper for them. But he, in my opinion, he really didn't explain the data very well that you really to make sense out of it. Because I guess he got hung up on the impacts on the moon or something. Anywho, but I'm so confident that I've never even gone on to do the research myself because I know this to me, and maybe I will go on. I'm not busy with something else, but it's like I'm at a point where I'm being a dead horse. I mean, I look at the theory of evolution and I wonder, with Charles Darwin going and running more and more experiments and investigations, and I'm like going, or anyone else trying to come up with a theory of evolution, I'm going, come on, guys, we got it a long time ago. But you're right, for a lot of people, it's slow for them to see the truth.
But you got to remember, Darwin waited until he was at the end of his life to publish that, right? He expected this sort of fallout. And the other thing that really occurs to me is we are essentially talking about an evolutionary model, right? We're talking about planets evolving. I mean, specifically the Earth. But that I've really noticed the word evolution creeping into planetary science in the last decade, right? There's a subtext now appearing, especially as we're able to go out there and see, what we consider early solar systems forming, and things are in different places than we would formerly have expected them. And so there's this idea that planets are evolving. I think that's starting to become, I would ultimately say the theory of evolution is being applied at these larger scales to astrophysical processes as well. So, you are doing an evolutionary theory ultimately.
Well, there's two things here. There's a theory of evolution that applies to species, and what comes after my theory on the Earth having a thicker atmosphere, following up on that is my theory on planetary evolution. Okay, and the two, work together, and this is like earlier, I almost like want to drive home the idea of first that size matters in the square cube law, then drive home the ideal that that the atmosphere during the Mesozoic was extremely thick, and let that sink in. People get that, and then we go to the theory of planetary evolution that brings it all together.
Because that's the mechanism, essentially, right?
How thick are we talking? Did we establish that? How thick are we talking? Like how thick was this atmosphere in your estimation?
We're talking hundreds of times thicker than what it is today. That is about, for if you look at the shape of dinosaurs, of what it would be, how thick would it have to be for it to for a tail to really be effective at pushing through a fluid. And if you look at the fact that dinosaurs were 3 to 4 times larger than what animals are today, how much would it have to reduce their effective weight so that they could grow so large? We're looking at the dinosaurs or the atmosphere to be in a ballpark of 600, 700 times thicker than what it is now.
And does that make it more like a fluid than a gas at that point? What's the phase diagram of this situation?
Or actually, a fluid is a gas is a fluid.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. All right. Got you there.
But
yeah.
But we have distinct transitions that we generally think of, right? This is the Andrews revolution, and the idea that matter changes discretely at different pressures and temperatures. So would this gaseous atmosphere have been closer to what we think of as a fluid on the phase diagram?
That's a great question. Of just do we call this thing a fluid or a gas? I mean, I would think it's more. Well, it's a very, very thick gas that I mean, it's almost like semantics of what is it?
Well, it matters a lot. This same dialogue is occurring concerning the composition of the sun as well, right? There was a huge debate for almost 100 years about the composition of the sun, whether it was a gas or a liquid or whatever. And eventually the astrophysicists were just like, well, it's a plasma. And you're like, what's a plasma? And they're like, well, it's anything between a fluid and a gas. It's kind of whatever we want, really. And you're like, well, what are the properties of it? And it's like, well, it's essentially a metal. And you're like, so is it a fluid metal? And they're like, well, kind of, but we call it a plasma. And so it's like, it gets into this weird realm. And that turns out to really matter in terms of big cosmological ideas, like whether a gas is capable of producing the same sort of spectra and so forth. So I do think it's an interesting thing to ponder when we're talking about this really thick atmosphere, that the line between gas and fluid is pretty blurry at that point.
I gotta remind you, it's gas and liquid. Gas and liquids are both fluids.
Oh, I'm sorry. Gas and liquid, yes.
Yeah, and I'm sorry. Even though my background is in physics, and you start to talk about the plasma of the sun, I haven't dove into that. So
no worries. It's just something that comes up on this show all the time. It's something we're dealing with, and it's a similar crisis of phase diagrams as well, right? And it has different consequences. It's a whole other can of worms, but the consequences are not insubstantial in that paradigm as well. Whether you treat something as a liquid or whether you treat it as a gas really matters in terms of the spectra that it can generate. But yeah, it seems like we have a similar kind of blurriness going on here.
Yeah, the standard explanation, pretty much, I would even say like high school or college, is there's gas or solid, liquid, gas, plasma. And plasma is something where the electrons are stripped away from the nucleus.
So when you have this really dense atmosphere, so we're talking about 600 times denser than we have today, how does that affect the temperature?
That's a good question. That gets back to why we have this uniform global climate during the Mesozoic. Because you have this fluid is going to be much more efficient at transferring heat from the lower latitudes to the higher latitudes. If you look at Venus is 90 times thicker than Earth. And so we're talking about being much thicker than that. So Venus has a one cell convection pattern in each of its hemisphere, transferring the heat from the lower latitudes around the equator up to the polar regions. And it has, because it has a nearly uniform temperature. So I would imagine that would have the same effect on Earth with an extremely thick atmosphere. And that would solve this problem that they're having of trying to explain why there is such tremendous uniformity of temperature all over the Earth during the Mesozoic era.
Wow, that's really cool. Yeah, I'd forgotten about that aspect. That's really interesting. Okay, so this kind of leads you towards an atmosphere, like a real climate-based model of how this happened, right? Because I'm sure everybody's wondering why we don't still have a thick atmosphere, and what sort of changes throughout the evolution of the Earth have led this to happen. In your estimation, did this happen more than once? And what are the processes that led it to happen?
Okay, yeah, thanks. When I first got to the point where I'm realizing there's a really thick atmosphere, then I'm like, my next questions were, well, what did this atmosphere consist of? How did the thick atmosphere get there? And what happened to it that disappeared? And is it going to keep on disappearing to the point we no longer have an atmosphere? So that started the next phase of all this research, really. And that's where I started looking. We get into the theory of planetary evolution, that we're trying to answer the questions of, well, for instance, where does a planet get its atmosphere? And it is really amazing how, I mean, what I'm doing and what I'm saying, it's really pretty basic scientific questions. And you don't realize this, typically students don't realize this because they're so busy trying to learn all this science that, hey, wait a minute, you didn't explain this or that. You just said this or that and moved on. And so, like, if you're taking an astronomy course, they'll tell you what the Earth's atmosphere is, and they'll tell you what Venus's atmosphere or Mars's atmosphere and so on. But they don't give any explanation for why it is the way it is. And so let me try to fill in that gap there. Okay. So if you look at the solar system, it basically breaks down in two groups for planets. You have the outer planets that are the giants, the gaseous giants, and they're mainly consistent of hydrogen and helium. And why they exist is because when you're farther out from the sun, they can hold, their gravitational field is strong enough that they can hold on to those lighter elements, those lighter gases. Okay. And closer to the sun, you've got Mercury, Venus, Earth, and Mars, your terrestrial planets. They can hold on to that hydrogen and helium. Okay, so they don't get that. They get gases, but they're heavier gases that they can hold on to. You also got, most of your moons, they can't hold on to any atmosphere at all. So you see them all covered with craters and so forth. But anyway, while the outer gases are primarily hydrogen and helium, the inner planets, well, Mercury is like a moon because it can't hold on. It's too close to the sun. It's too small to hold on to anything. The inner planets of Venus, Earth, and Mars, their atmospheres are primarily carbon dioxide, 97% carbon dioxide with about 2 or 3% nitrogen.
Except for us.
Except for us, exactly. Thank you. So, and here's the thing: when scientists go and discuss about Venus or Mars, oftentimes you hear them talk about how runaway greenhouse effect on Venus, or they talk, well, what happened to Mars's atmosphere? And the reality is, they don't have a theory on why these planets have the atmospheres that they have to begin with. They're just out there guessing. Okay, the reality is a primarily carbon dioxide atmosphere, along with a small amount, a few percentage of nitrogen, that is the standard terrestrial planet atmosphere. Okay, so that's, where we start. And you might, and we go into, well, why is there this difference in the thickness of these atmospheres?
With us.
No, we got,
okay, I see.
Well, like Venus has a much thicker atmosphere than Mars does, right?
Yeah, it's like a refrigerator effect on Mars and a greenhouse situation on Venus.
Well, the distance from the sun is the huge factor of what the temperature is on a planet. Okay, and I mean, the warmest temperature on Mars is cold in the Antarctic on Earth. It's cold there. Okay, and Venus is surprisingly warm, much warmer than you'd expect Mercury to be the warmest planet, but it's not. Venus is actually warmer than Mercury. But we first have to figure out, why do these planets have variance in their atmospheres, and what happened? Then before we go to what happened to Earth's atmosphere that doesn't have that's different from the other two.
Okay.
So and I have to back up here and say, I'm just taking off everybody as far as science goes.
Obviously.
I mean,
It goes without saying.
This is not. I mean, I think I don't want people to get the wrong impression about me. I'm not out there spewing outrageous ideas about how science is. I'm a very conservative physics instructor. I mean, I have these things checked by more than one way, and I'm not the first one to jump on the bandwagon when someone comes out with a new idea.
I mean, I think that the context of what we do on the show is that we bring people on that have ideas that are outside of consensus. And we ask questions about how the theories work in order to be able to make sure that the theory is well-founded in physical principles and evidence. And so
we also bring on the people who are defending the standard narratives and put these ideas in front of them. And
those episodes don't do as good, but we do
well,
do that.
sometimes it's fun to watch them squirm.
Yeah. I mean, and so I think that it's the water in which we swim. Like, we take for granted that science as a whole discipline tends to not want to shift its ideas. And we operate with that as the backdrop. And ideas that people propose on the show are often ideas that if you put them into a room full of, consensus scientists would elicit a rabid response. But they're not in the room with us, and we don't have to worry about them. We can deal with them later. And so it seems like what you're really digging at right here is that you have a model by which atmospheres form and are lost. And you're using these 3 planets of Mars, Venus, and Earth to draw your conclusions. And so lay it out for us.
Thank you. Yes. All right. So they should be all primarily carbon dioxide atmosphere with a little bit of nitrogen. And it's based on the first idea is when everything formed, that all the planets formed out of the same soup of material, and the same processes acted on all the planets, that we had this disk of material forming, that what goes on the Earth even today is a key to what happened to the Earth in the past, and a key to what happened on these planets. That's how they're all connected that way. And we shouldn't just look at these planets and say, "My gosh, they look so different." We got to think about what's the scientific, the physics processes that are going on that took them from all being this, having all this in common, to take them to where they are now. All right, so they're all putting out the same type of material because they were made out of the same material. All right, and so what would that material be? Where does this atmosphere come from? Well, we look at volcanic emissions that exist today, and we see that every volcano is quite a bit different from the next. There's quite a bit of variation in how large the volcano is and what its output is. So it's kind of hard to average it all together. So, but roughly the best that I or anyone else could do would say that about 55-60% of the output of volcanoes is water vapor. That's the main thing outputted. And then we have about 25-30% being carbon dioxide. And then about 10% sodium dioxide. And then about 5% or so of all kinds of just other kinds of toxic gases of one form or another, or not toxic gases.
Sodium dioxide or sulfur dioxide?
sulfur dioxide.
Sorry, I thought I misheard it. I heard sodium.
No, you said sodium.
Okay. But just to focus on the first two, we've got water and carbon dioxide. All right. And strangely enough, on Earth, we have all this water. And on our two neighboring planets of Venus and Mars, Mars has a little water frozen on its surface. And there's always this question of whether we can find a little bit of water there. But mostly, we just have this thin, very thin carbon dioxide atmosphere. And we have a very thick carbon dioxide atmosphere on Venus. So, but the main thing is that I want to get at is this is the source of these planets' atmosphere. It comes from the volcanoes, and once it doesn't exactly match the volcanic outgassing, doesn't exactly match the atmosphere of a planet, because once a gas is released onto the surface, there's other things that can happen. It's either going to, like oxygen, oxygen's going to chemically bond with just about anything. All right. So, and then if you have any hydrogen or helium, of course, it's going to be lost to space for these terrestrial planets. For the water, it's going to settle out and form the oceans on the Earth. Okay. And so there is, but that is the point is that's the source. The volcanic gases are the source of these atmospheres for these planets. So then the next question is, why is it that Mars has an atmosphere that's like 100 to 150 times thinner than the Earth, while Venus has an atmosphere that's 90 times larger? Okay, and so to answer that question, we need to think of what is the pumping mechanism that is driving these volcanic gases to the surface of the planet and causing them to come out onto the surface. And that driving mechanism is primarily heat. And not just heat, but particular type of heat. And again, I'm going to upset some more scientists because I'm getting another area. It used to be debated more among geologists as to what is the source of the Earth's internal heat. And they used to list a few options. But we're back to that groupthink in their echo chamber, and after a while they keep on finding out now mostly they're saying it's radioactive decay. Okay. Well, okay. No, that's not what it is. And here's why. When astronomers are trying to figure out, well, what is heating Jupiter's moon Io, which they say is the most active volcanic body in the solar system, they said, well, radioactive decay isn't working here. Instead, it's tidal heating. So Io is going around Jupiter, and every 3.5 days, it's passing Europa, and it's pulled towards it, and that puts a strain on it, and so that's driving this tidal heat, and stretching, constant stretching every few days, is what creates this tidal heating, generates heat in its interior, and drives these volcanic gases to the surface. All right, so you got two competing ideas on what's the source of a planet's or moon's internal heat. And so generally in science, somebody's right, somebody's wrong, and it's usually one is more dominant that eventually, that's kind of the case we have here. Which one is it? Well, what astronomers are finding out is that this tidal heating isn't just working for Io, it's working at other planets as well. And when you look at all the planets in our solar systems, yeah, it works for all of them, including the Earth. And it's
well, we have one of the biggest moon to planet mass ratios of all of them, right? So our moon is relatively pretty enormous, and so it's conceivable that there's certainly some tidal processes. I mean, we see the tide on the water, obviously, but the idea is it must be going on underground as well.
And so is the increased heating of Venus largely due to its proximity to the sun?
Yes.
Yes. But so there's two factors at play there, right? Because you have the proximity to the sun in the infrared, and then you also have the proximity in terms of gravitation. And so do you tease apart the surface heating versus the internal heating from the tidal friction?
Yeah, don't bring it in the infrared. The surface heating from the sun has nothing to do with the internal heating.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the internal heating is all based upon the tidal pole on it.
Friction.
And so, pardon me?
Friction.
Yeah, you have this frictional pole constantly, and the closer you are to the host. So for the planets, the closer the planet is to the host, the sun, the more tidal heating it's going to experience. Likewise on Jupiter, likewise on Saturn, the closer the moon that's closest to the Jupiter is going to experience the most tidal heating. The ones farther away, successively less.
And so in terms of tidal heating with, let's compare Venus and Mercury.
Okay.
Venus has a tremendous amount of volcanism. Does Mercury have volcanism?
It has a magnetic field which is attributed to its tidal interactions.
Which does?
Mercury.
But why wouldn't Mercury... So if the inside of the Earth is heated by proximity to the sun...
And the moon. And the moon.
Did I say Earth?
Yeah.
I meant planet. I'm sorry. I was speaking in a mythological sense. So if the proximity of the planet to the sun is decisive in terms of its interior heat, and Mercury is closer than Venus, would you expect it to have more internal heat?
Yeah. Okay. You have to, as planets evolve, they go through their evolution.
Mm.
And you have like say our moon is geologically dead.
Mm.
And you have and you have Mercury. It's sitting there as close as it could be to the closest planet to the sun. That thing's pretty much spent. That whatever was inside it's about the same size. I think Mercury is about roughly the same size as the Earth's moon. That whatever water that once had in its interior, it's pretty much spent.
But that's inconsistent with the idea that it has a magnetic field. It really kind of bothers me because the explanation for magnetic field generation concerns molten metallic liquids. Again, some phase of metal that's in motion, which is capable of generating these eddy currents. And so, yeah, it does appear to be geologically dead on the surface, but at the same time, we're like, tidal heating is responsible for its magnetic fields, which is just sort of
I mean, there's weird. That's weird, right?
It is weird, and there's it's very, very hard to teach intro astronomy because you find yourself standing at the front of an auditorium being like, yeah, this doesn't make sense. Sorry, guys. You know, I literally apologize for astronomers like 3 times a class. It's kind of a thing, you know. But that's how it works. We just don't understand everything, and we're here trying to figure it out. So
I'll be the first to say, like the magnetic field, I haven't yet made too much sense out of it, and I can't emphasize this enough. I mean, I realize that I irk a lot of scientists off. But before I say, you know, this is how it works, here's the evidence for it, I've got a fair amount of evidence, you know, backing up what I'm saying, and more than one source that I don't believe in going out on a limb. So I haven't really got into that magnetism issue, and I haven't yet figured out the rhyme or reason totally on what's going on there.
Well, you're in good company, it seems like, then, because nobody else has either.
Okay. All right. So to explain why Venus has such a thick atmosphere and Mars does not, well, Venus is closer to the sun. And so, and this tidal heating, it's a function of R cubed in the denominator. So proximity is extremely important. It's why for the Earth, the moon is such a stronger tidal effect than the sun. Okay, so it's a much stronger effect on Venus than it is on Mars. This tidal heating.
Right.
And
can I just add one more thing too, that just to make this even more confusing? Venus has all sorts of geologic activity in the sense of magma and all of this, but it has no magnetic field. So
Venus doesn't have a magnetic field?
No.
What?
Yeah, I know. It's just absolutely terrible. Yeah. So anyways, I just wanted to say you're not expected to explain magnetic fields to us because nothing makes sense about them. I think
I'm not going to.
Yeah, it's fine. I just couldn't help but throw that out there.
As I say, I know my limitations. Okay, I mean, maybe someday I'll jump into that and research the heck out of it and come back and you'll hear from me later, but not now. I know that there's some things I've stayed and some things I don't, and that's not one. So I'm not going to comment on that.
No worries, man. If you ever think of anything, I will be the first person lined up to hear about it.
Well, thank you. Okay, so does it make sense now that Venus is actually, it's not as big as the Earth, but it's comparable in size. And so there's more mass there. And that's a factor, too, of how much volcanic fluids it can pump to the surface. But the main criteria is the fact that it's closer to the sun. So the tidal heating is going to be much more significant on it than it is on Mars. And hence, that's the reason why Venus has a much thicker atmosphere than Mars.
Now, Mars does have some of the biggest volcanoes in the solar system, too, which is a bit strange.
That's a gravity thing. It's not strange at all. It has to do with the fact, we didn't get to this in talking about what affects the size of animals, but one of the suggestions would be if you're living on a planet where the gravitational field is less because it's a smaller planet, well, the animals, the terrestrial animals are going to grow larger. So, in science fiction movies, they're constantly, buzzing around the galaxy, and they never take in consideration that from one planet to the next, the gravitational fields are different, and so the inhabitants should be different sizes. It just confuses the story.
Well, this is actually an interesting proxy, right? Because buoyancy would lessen the perception of gravity, right? So if gravity on Earth was the same now as it was during the time of the dinosaurs, and the dinosaurs are bigger because of buoyancy, you would expect to be able to see a proxy in terms of mountain height as well, right? Like we talked about sand dunes before, but if the explanation for the large volcano on Mars is decreased gravity, then increased buoyancy should also give you larger mountains, right? Or is that...
That's true. It's excellent thought. Yeah.
But it's transient, right? So, how long does it take to build a mountain? And you'd have to reconstruct it off... I mean, oh God, we were looking at the Expanding Earth for one of the videos we did on the Investigations channel, and I realized that there is some attempt to reconstruct mountain heights from the past based off of the depth of the sedimentary basins of their erosion. Like, the Appalachians are thought to have once been taller than the Himalayas, and all of that sediment is deposited in the west. And so the Grand Canyon cuts through the detritus of the Appalachian Mountains that was brought from the East Coast to the West Coast by, I'm not totally sure of the mechanism of that, but there are the Great Plains, so I don't know. But there are fields that attempt to reconstruct the size of historical mountain ranges. And if you could see a trend where the historical mountain ranges were all thought to be much taller than the mountain ranges that we have on Earth today, then that might
particularly the volcanic ones.
Particularly the volcanic ones, then that might be a really interesting That might be an interesting proxy.
Okay. Yeah, that's an interesting thought. I wasn't aware that the deposits were that far west from the Appalachians.
Yes.
I can see that.
Well, this is I give backpacking tours sometimes, and we go to the Grand Canyon. And in the Grand Canyon, that's the story that the rangers always tell, because it's so visceral to think about the Appalachians being so old that what you see in front of you is basically the disintegrated mountains.
Yeah. I have to say, my background is in physics, but I love the other science disciplines like geology and biology. And I love the fact that I got into this physics first, because it enables me to look at these fields and I feel I understand them better than people that jump right past the physics and now trying to make sense of things. I can look at things in biology and make sense of so many things, and I love geology because it really pushes the imagination. You go hiking and you pick up a marine shell or marine animal fossil, and just imagine that while you're on a mountain trail that was once below sea level. Mm-hmm. It's so mind-boggling, and I love that.
I mean, the tallest mountain on the Earth is not Everest. The tallest mountain on Earth is Mauna Kea, which is the tip of a volcano that has roots at the bottom of the ocean. And so it's almost 10,000 meters taller than Everest. Am I reading that correctly?
From its base, like not from sea level, but
yeah. So it's like it's a pretty significant boost to be able to grow underwater, because you're kind of you're supported by that. And so that might be I don't know how to look at that geologically, but that seems like an interesting proxy. We'll have to chase that down.
All right, so these atmospheres are changing. They're changing, and you have started to lay out the groundwork for that. What was different on Earth?
Okay. Well, I've established the fact that why Venus is a much thicker atmosphere than Mars, but here I'm saying that the Earth's atmosphere was even far thicker than Venus, and maybe you already can guess what that would be by now, or not.
Lay it on us.
Oh, darn.
What?
Okay. Well, the moon. The moon has much stronger tidal forces acting on the Earth, because the moon is so close to the Earth. As I said, it's a proximity thing. There's much stronger tidal forces on the Earth. It's pumped the Earth much more than Venus. And so that's why the Earth has, or used to have, a much thicker atmosphere. Now, as I said, I'd like to get more than one direction of argument to before I go and say, yeah, that's the answer. And there's something in astronomy that they pretty much virtually ignore, and that is the density of planets and moons. You can go and look at the densities of planets and moons, and it correlates with this tidal heating. That is, the planets and moons that have got the most pumping of this tidal heating, that the lighter material being pumped to the surface, and much of it lost to space, because it's you got your hydrogen and helium that's lost. Those are the denser objects in the solar system. So you have Earth has been pumped incredible amount because of the close proximity of the moon, and so it's the most dense object in the solar system.
Because it got rid of all of the light stuff. Essentially, it coughed it out.
Yeah. All this the water, the carbon dioxide, the hydrogen, the helium, all that, and whatever else, it's all been pumped to the surface. And then once it gets there, as I said earlier, there's various directions it can take depending on, its physics properties, whether it's a really light molecule, gas molecule, or its chemical properties. Say like oxygen, it's going to bond with something on the surface. Okay, but it's been doing a lot of pumping. So, as far as the theory of planetary evolution, these planets are shrinking, okay, because of this heating. And you can look at the planets and see their evolution. If you go to the farthest extremes of the solar system, what do you have? You have these basically ice rocks, dirty ice balls out there. And what is that? It's because those objects way out there, they don't get the tidal heating. So the way they form is the way they stay. They're not really evolving at all. Where at the other extreme, you got to have like the moon and Mercury, that they've gone all the way through the process to now they're geologically dead. And then you have the planets in between. So it's like this whole thing opens up just a huge understanding of how the solar system, of understanding the solar system, where before, if you didn't understand the tidal heating thing, you really weren't getting it at all. So the Earth should have the thickest atmosphere based upon the physics properties of what's going on.
And I love that it correlates to the fact that it also has the strongest magnetic field of anything its size as well. Like this correlates really nicely, actually, if we are going to say that magnetism is a result of tidal processes. It kind of...
Well, you keep wanting to drag me down that trail.
Man, I'm sorry. I just can't help but see the correlations. It's just...
I'm going to have to investigate now.
Yeah,
it's my curiosity.
I think it correlates perfectly. I think that it's worth checking out. And it's another one of those crises, just like the size of dinosaurs, that people are really struggling with.
Okay. So maybe I will get into that. Clean up what I'm doing with the dinosaur theory site and then go on to that next. But
yeah, you may as well apply it to all the planets eventually, right? I mean, there must be these enormous evolutionary stories to the planets themselves. So yeah.
Honestly, when I first did this, I really didn't think that I would get snagged up in this long battle of getting this all accepted and everything. I was naive, and I thought I got this one, and I go, wow, this is great. I can figure this stuff out. I'll go on to the next one, but that hasn't happened yet. So maybe at some point I will, and that'll be fun. So I'll continue on with the story of what happened to the Earth, right? All right. So the Earth should have the thickest atmosphere. Not just that, it's primarily carbon dioxide. All right, so what happened to it? All right, well, I'm not going to go back too far in the geological history. Once we go back around 350 million years, we don't have terrestrial animals. We have this glaciation that the geologists have, but I don't feel there's quite enough for to make a definite statement. So I'm going to let that go. I want to get to the stuff that I can at least verify from two different sources.
Right on. I think it's really worth pointing out, just in case people aren't aware of it, how spotty the record is as you go further and further back. It's very, very hard to find fossils of things prior to this period. And so, yeah, I think that's a totally reasonable boundary condition for this discussion.
It just makes sense. The farther you go back, the more difficult is to find something and then to interpret the data. That's the challenge, because I mean, maybe there was that evidence at one time, but now it's turned into metamorphic rock, and you can't. It's gone. So yeah, you're exactly right. So I'm going to not go any farther back than say the Carboniferous period, and just look for a moment here. That's the Permian and Carboniferous periods. At the end of the Paleozoic, that's 245 to 360 million years ago. Okay, so that's during that time. It was the later half of the Carboniferous and the Permian. That was a ice glaciation existed, and so that would be a thin atmosphere, period. Okay. All right. What happened at the end of the Permian period was, now I gotta think of this.
A switch got flipped. A switch got flipped somehow.
A switch got flipped?
Yeah, what caused this very discrete change?
They call it the mother of all mass extinctions. And now I'm trying to review all this information that I came across. I'm sure I got it on my website, but it's I can't keep all this in my mind anymore. But it's by far the biggest mass extinction that ever occurred on Earth. Happened right at the end of the Permian period. And so what is that? You have all it's the cause of it pretty much agreed upon is Siberian tramps. When they call some of the tramps, what they mean is a super volcano. As I said earlier, we tend to think of volcanoes as being just one size, but that's not really how it goes. The size of a volcano can vary tremendously by several magnitudes of being larger, and that's what these things are. So just a huge eruption in Siberia, and so all this gas being poured out, volcanic gas being poured out on the surface, but that's not all. It's got a lot of toxic gases there, and it's killing off all these species. And so you've got nothing that's removing the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere anymore. And what I mean by the primary, you might think about like plant life, like trees and so forth, as the main thing for removing carbon from the atmosphere, but that's not actually it. The main mechanism for removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere is marine life. Mm-hmm. You have the whether it's microscopic or more larger sizes, these marine animals creating their shells. That's primarily, among other things, it contains the carbon dioxide that they're making, and they make what's called either limestone or dolomite. These are two types of sedimentary rocks, and together they make up over 20% of all the sedimentary rocks on the planet. So literally mountains of carbonated deposits.
And these are continuous deposits, right? And so that's what tells you that it's a discrete event that forms them, because it's not like there's
they're discontinuous deposits. That's what you mean?
No, I think that they're so you basically, like the White Cliffs of Dover, right? You have this huge white wall,
but it's still a banded structure.
The Cliffs of Dover? I'm not sure.
Well, yeah, because you go down below them, you're going to find something that's more metamorphic or something.
Yeah, but the deposit itself is continuous, is what I mean.
But it starts discretely, is what I mean.
Yeah, it starts discretely, and then it's continuous, and then above it there's a shift. And so that tells you that something happened that significantly changed the conditions that allows for, that creates a massive quantity of dead marine life.
Oh, and I'm just going to bust your bubble there.
All right.
Do it. That's the best.
Geologists can't figure out what forms dolomite.
But didn't you say that it was the marine
dolomite
skeletons?
problem?
Interesting.
So I'm leaning towards, and I think they are beginning to lean more towards a bacteria being involved.
Huh.
That is involved with taking in the carbon dioxide somehow and then dying off, and that's what's creating. And whereas the limestone is your marine shells, and dolomite tends to be a little bit more common farther back in the geological record, where the limestone, more recent, and it can be deposited fairly quickly.
I see. All right. I stand corrected.
Okay. Yeah, and that's just another thing that possibly once they realize that the atmosphere is considerably different, they might be able to solve the dolomite problem. So,
so what you're saying basically is the next time we have Yellowstone erupt or something, we can expect the potential of thick atmosphere to reappear, or something like that.
Well, I mean, okay, so the Siberian traps are crazy. There's the traps in general are not the kind of volcanic eruption that we think about where it's like one boom and then it goes. This is fissures open across a vast territory, and they spew basalt out, and they bury the land up to 1 kilometer deep in volcanic magma. And so
that's right.
And so this is not the explosive like Mazama crater that you see in Crater Lake. This is a very terrifying, earth-changing resurfacing of the planet.
Got it.
That happens sometimes for like 100,000 years, 500,000 years, and then the vents cool down and they block up and they stop.
I see. Can we expect that again in our future?
Hope not.
If the Earth is cooling and it's shrinking, it might be a young Earth problem.
Yeah.
Is my instincts. Like I think that
we're not going before 350 million years. So.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Okay.
When they refer to it as a mother of all mass extinctions, they're not overplaying it. It was a pretty big event, and for most of the Triassic, there just wasn't much life at all after that happened. I mean,
but you do think that this has happened more than once, right? You think we've been through multiple cycles of thick and thin atmosphere. Is that correct?
Again, I don't want to go too far.
Yeah.
I mean, okay, Mesozoic, it was thick. And through the closest time to us, the Cenozoic, that was a time of transition from thick to thin to what we have now. And before the Mesozoic, during the late Carboniferous and the Permian period, it was thin during that time. You look at the glacial record, and it's just hard to tell what exactly went on before that. And as you keep on reminding everyone, the farther you go back, the record starts to get a little bit more open to interpretation and hard to say definitely what happened. And so, and as I said, I'm a conservative scientist. I don't, if I can't get at least two different sources converging to a conclusion, I'm not going to make a statement on that. So
let me ask you though, I didn't totally understand why you think it was thinner before this event.
During the Carboniferous in the Permian? Great. Okay, well here's my two sources. Well, actually three. You have the glaciation, right? So I heard some geologists a long time ago talk about how the Permian period is pretty much like it is today as far as the climate goes, and that seems to be what he's referring to is that you do have this ice at the polar regions, just like it is now. Okay, so that's one bit of evidence. That would indicate that we're back to having three convection cells in each hemisphere instead of this one massive one, making it all the same. The other thing is we do have terrestrial animals coming up onto the land, and near the end of the Permian period, you have amphibians, and you have different reptiles emerging. And some of these amphibians, they got rather large, comparable to the size of crocodiles, alligators, but they didn't get any bigger. Reptiles, the same thing. Some of them got pretty big, but they didn't get any bigger. Nothing comparable or bigger than an elephant. And you're not going to find anything like that. So there's the same limitations that apply today were in effect then, as far as the size of the animals. Some people get confused about the giant insects. I don't know if I should even open up that can of worms. As they say.
Do it, because there was big insects back then, right?
Okay. All right. For every species, there's basically two big criteria of their environments. One's the physical environment. Okay, that is whether you're in the ocean or on the land, is it cold? You're in the polar regions or in the tropics, that sort of thing. That's your physical environment. Okay. The other aspect of your environment is the biological environment, because rarely, if ever, is a species alone in their environment. They have to compete with other species. They're trying to find something to eat. Something else is trying to eat them, and it drives, what's possible for them as far as how they evolve, what environmental niches that they can fit into. And we have to pay attention to both of those things and make sure that it's not one or the other before we make it a statement like this. Okay, so when creatures first started to evolve onto the land, it was first the arthropods, or the umbrella group for insects and spiders and crustaceans, I think. And so they're basically the creatures that have their protective outer hard surface. Forget the name for it, but anyway, that's their game plan of how they support themselves, as opposed to the vertebrates, which have the bones in the center of their bodies. Okay, so two different main ways of addressing this. And structurally, I mean, they each have their pros and cons. Essentially, what it means is that these insects, arthropods, they're better suited for being small, and the vertebrates are better at being larger. And the reason being is why it works out is because while having an outer structure, tough structure, is great from an engineer's perspective, it doesn't work well for animals because they're growing. And so from time to time, these insects or arthropods have to literally crawl themselves out of their skin and molt and create another one. And that's an issue, because you notice that the largest ones, that gravity starts to take an issue with they're all flat, like the very largest ones of these type of creatures. So it doesn't work well with them. Also, the way they breathe, they have holes in the sides of their bodies that brings in the air, and it works fine if you're small. But as you get larger, it becomes less and less efficient, that they can hardly move for the bigger ones. If they move, they're moving really slow. Consequently, when vertebrates and insects, when the two meet, it's almost always the case where the vertebrate wins. You got the birds eating the insects type of thing. Not always, but pretty much. So insects do better at small sizes. All right. That also leads to another thing in evolution. Another concept I have to introduce here is that the smaller a creature is, the faster its turnover rate. That is, insects, we're talking a matter of days by the time they go from being born hatch from an egg to where they're laying eggs. Where for vertebrates, we're talking more like months or years before, going from being born or hatched or whatever to create the next generation. And what that means as far as evolution goes is that in the same time the vertebrate is going through one cycle, the insects can be going through 50 cycles. And if it's going through 50 cycles, it means it can evolve far faster than the vertebrates. That's a long explanation. I'm sorry about that.
No, it makes sense. So basically, they're on different timetables. Like these species aren't very ripe for comparison in terms of examining the environment so much, because it depends on different processes. Their
hysteresis is different,
yeah.
Right? Because if you take generation time to be the rate at which you can update body plan, you'll have a different rate at which you can respond to the environment.
Exactly. Yes. So that's essentially why these arthropods were able to evolve onto the land literally tens of millions of years before the vertebrates. So when they first came out there, they had the land all to themselves. There weren't any birds coming down from the sky picking off the insects.
I love that. Yeah.
And so among themselves, it didn't matter if a really large insect grew to gigantic size. There's no vertebrate around it to pick it off or eat it. So, it's the best thing going.
That's really, really interesting. After Mount St. Helens erupted, there were all of these new lakes that had been formed. And so, and it's this completely devastated environment, but they're not totally sure how fish got back into the lakes. They assumed that most of the fish had died in the eruption because the lakes got really hot. So the story of how they were reseeded is kind of unclear. They think that maybe some very enthusiastic fishermen came in and actually dropped a starting population in. But they grew to unbelievable sizes. They were finding these enormous trout because there was nobody who was fishing them because the environment was closed and there was nobody else living there. And so they didn't have anybody there weren't any birds around, there weren't any predators around. And so they were able to grow to these enormous sizes until they basically choked themselves out. And then their population size got smaller and smaller again. Or the body plan got smaller and smaller again. And so there's maybe a period of 5 or 10 years where you had these massive fish in these lakes. And then I think that they ate everything because there was a lot of bacteria in the water and a lot of microorganisms. And as they consumed all the microorganisms and the environment became poorer nutritionally, they by necessity had to shrink back down. But it's just you can see that if you enter into an environment where there's a little competition and abundant food for whatever it is that you're eating, then you're golden for a while to get as big as you want.
Obesity epidemic.
I have to agree. Biology is so much fun, and it's fun to figure out what's going on, and there's all kinds of stories like that of how you start with a fresh environment, and it's fascinating what evolves. Whether it's a new volcanic island or maybe it's a new forest that's been cut down and then it grows back. It goes through stages about which trees grow there first, and another set of trees grow there, and on and on. And it's fun stuff.
Well, and so we know basically what this brings us to is that the animal life has to be a proxy for the environment.
Exactly.
Because if it wasn't, then you would cut down the forest, and what would grow up would be the same forest that you cut down. But because you've significantly changed the environment, the amount of light, the amount of nutrients, the amount of wildlife, you've significantly changed the profile of the things that grow back. And so a successional forest, if allowed to live for long enough, will become old growth, but it won't look the same. And you'll never be able to start with the same profile of trees. And so if you go back in time and you're looking at fossils, you have to assume that the fossils, as imperfect as the record is, they're telling you something about what the environment was like, and you have to be able to read them. And if you're not, then you're cutting off some valuable source of information.
Excellent point. Yes, exactly. The fossil evidence is evidence of the environment. And there's this interplay between what the environment is will determine what species evolve, and then what species are there themselves will change the environment. And it's just it's fun stuff to think about.
And I think that this is at the heart of your theory, which is that the planet is not a stable place that will always be the same or has always looked the same. There are different factors that can be read through these various ancient proxies that can tell us much more than we than we know right now about the past.
And that it's really critical that we think about evolution as a feedback loop as well, oftentimes. I think this is something that gets lost in the really simple Darwinian evolutionary lectures that you'll find, or the understanding that most scientists have. But there's this almost infinite complexity that develops as the result of these feedback loops where the organisms are being shaped by their environment, but they're shaping the environment as they go. Nowhere is this more evident than in the human species, right? We're completely remodeling the earth. That's obviously like one of the hottest topics in science, politicized science right now. But, there's no doubt that organisms change the niche, and the niche then changes them. And, it can't be overemphasized, I believe.
Yeah, I think where you're getting to is the fact that currently we're in the sixth mass extinction of all time, and unlike the past ones that were primarily driven by volcanic activity, the one currently occurring is because of human overpopulation that is driving the other species to extinction. Really pretty sad.
I would say that it's overconsumption rather than overpopulation.
And like dirty tech and just...
Yeah, like I think that there's probably plenty of space for people on Earth if we found ways to be more careful with our resources.
Yeah,
we're so wasteful. Like, right? Like, just I look at our trash can all the time, just like how much plastic is in it, how many things we use and then we use once and we throw them away, or how many things are disposable in our society. Our laptops go out of date.
We're really allergic to these overpopulation statements because, like, usually the people that are making those statements, like, imagine the solution is to depopulate the earth, but they're not talking about, like, their own family, right? They're, like, imagining depopulating the people on the other continents that they don't have to worry about or whatever.
Because the guy...
Yeah, that's awful.
Well, the guy who really popularized modern overpopulation fears, his name was Paul Ehrlich, and he still works at Stanford, and he wrote this book called The Population Bomb in the 70s. And you read the book and it's horrifying because he's like, okay, well, we've tried to talk to India about lowering their birth rates and they haven't. And so what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to cut off aid and let them starve. And what we also should do is we should start putting contraceptives in the water to force them into sterility. And it's just said as like a matter-of-fact thing.
It's not like he's going to do that to his own kids. You know what I mean?
He only had one child. I'll give him that.
I mean, okay, fair enough. But I don't know. It's just you got to be really careful with because population is a proxy for other processes that are destructive and so forth. So.
And I can imagine a condition where humans have a better relationship to the environment and have more relationship to stewardship on an individual level, right? Not in a way that depends on governments, but depends on going to the grocery store and only buying things that are in glass containers as opposed to plastic, or deciding consciously to shop in the bulk bins, or there's like little things that people can do to change the way that they live their lives. And by voting with your wallet, I think that you can force change in a way that doesn't have this I hate the anti-human aspect of it. Where it's like, oh, the humans are so bad. And I'm like, yeah, maybe, but there's also so much beauty and so much magnificence in the human project that we're sitting here and we're talking about this idea of the dinosaurs.
We're also amazing cultivars and we have the potential.
Cultivators.
Cultivars. We're amazing cultivators. We actually just did a podcast yesterday where the conclusion was, the guy that we were talking to, Shane, was saying that, it's conceivable that our future is a lot brighter than our past, where we actually take responsibility for all of the other, organisms. It was a very bright, purposeful destiny for humankind, being sort of like the caretakers rather than, just some passive actors on the planet.
Like he's a plant breeder, and his vision is he's like, look, we have the ability to reseed the earth with species that have never been seen before. Like, we can be the force that turns away from the destructive aspects and instead turns to creation. And I don't know, I like that more than the sense of,
People need, you would probably agree that people right now are starved for meaning to some extent, right? We have all of the comforts, but, this unifying narrative that really locks people together has never been more absent than it is in the present. As we got more rational, we turned away from myth and from religion, and it seems that it's not been really good for us as a people in terms of bonding us together and having some overarching purpose to our lives.
I find your viewpoints really refreshing, and I mean, I've been calling myself the naive one, but I'm gonna have to address that to you. I mean, you're pretty positive about the human race, and from what I've been seeing, and I hope that you're right, but I don't. I guess we're diverging a little bit off topic here about the overpopulation thing, but it's. I wish the world was a much better place than what it was, and I'd like to do more to make it a better place. And I would hope that there would be more people in this world that thought the same, and we could push in that direction.
Well, I think it's just important to remember that we do have control in a way that other passive animals might not have. We have the ability to analyze the situation and make changes, and that's unique. And so despite the fact that everything's pretty messed up in all these departments right now, we do at least possess the possibility of changing that. And I think that's as far as my optimism goes. I'm not saying it's going to work out. I'm just like, look, we could.
Like, we could turn towards the good as opposed to wallowing in the mess that we're in right now. And I think that that's the goal of this project. Like, some of the most satisfying comments that we get are from people who understand the mission of the project. Who are like, we need more conversations like this. We need more places that are focused on building something as opposed to tearing things down. I think that that's what's so cool about your work, which is that you faced criticism from the Academy. And instead of just kind of throwing your hands up and then turning to criticizing them in return, you built this whole theory out. You put together these ideas and you built something. And that's so important in the world. And it's so good to hear it.
Thank you. That was kind of my fear that in presenting a different view that, I'm trying not to come off as just ripping on other scientists, but, and sometimes I fear that that's the way I come across. But yeah, I just, from the very get-go, I was being kind of a nerd and just saying, here's my idea. And not get into personal about who's right or wrong, but just, could you listen to what my idea is? And here's the evidence. And could you be scientists and weigh that evidence? And so that's my perspective on it.
And it's hard to not become embittered when you have an idea and you try to tell it to people, and instead of helping you figure out the best way to say it, they turn on you and they treat you poorly because they, for whatever reason, but it's you. I want to have a scientific venue where people with ideas that they've started developing can figure out how to talk about them better, can figure out how to present them better, can figure out how to make it something that is a collaborative, growth-oriented project, rather than just being a thing where people get in a room and they just bump their chests like silverback gorillas. And we have enough of those rooms. We don't need another one.
Yeah, I'd certainly welcome it to have more discourse on and to be able to actually talk to other scientists more, and for them to, if they got constructive criticism of or throw up objections and so forth that makes me think about, okay, how do I address that and so forth, that hammer out a better understanding of how the Earth and the other planets evolved and all this other stuff. I'm all for it. That's what scientists are supposed to do.
Is there a place? Do you have a forum somewhere where people can?
I mean, I wanted to mention his blog is incredible.
Yeah,
So all the things that we've talked about today, guys, for the listeners, go check out what is it? Dinosaur Theory.
Dinosaur Theory.
And it's just beautiful. There's several chapters laid out. It's essentially laid out like a book. And you can follow up on all these concepts in depth, and there's figures, and you can really see it illustrated, these principles with regard to the structure of the dinosaurs. And, towards the end, you lay out this mechanism with the evolving climate. And so everybody absolutely has to go and check that out. We'll put a link to it in the description. But do you have you put that into a hardcover book yet, or anything like that, or a paper book of some sort, or do you have plans for that?
Gosh, when I first started writing it, I was trying to get into the book route of things, but I just didn't get any takers. And so, I don't know where to proceed from now, because it's just, I mean, I don't want to fall in the category, like I say, a vanity press thing that I'm publishing something, going through all that work, and I don't have people out there reading, and sadly, yeah, I got bashed pretty hard by the paleontologists, and so I have to question how many people are out there that would be able to find, buy my book.
I bet, man, we could have sold a few copies today. I guarantee you. It's I wouldn't put it out of the question. You never know when these things can take off. You put a book out, it could sit on the shelf for a while, but I think that these ideas would be super valuable, and because it's the kind of thing that you want to be able to pull out and reference, right? That's what's nice about written material, I think, as opposed to just online content, is it's really easy to just mark things up or go back and really, some of the deepest ideas I have to really keep coming back, and then finally it kind of clicks with me. And so, yeah, I wouldn't sell yourself short. That might be a cool project to see happen.
If I find someone that wants to publish my work, and I'm all for that. Yeah, of course, that's I'm trying to push these ideas forward in whatever way possible.
Very cool.
Yeah, I think you're doing an awesome job. I
Thank you.
If people, sometimes people ask you, like, what's your dream interview? Like, who would you want to interview if you could interview anybody? And the last few years, I wouldn't have said, Obama or something. I would have wanted to talk to you. And it's been a long time. I'm serious. This is one of the most fascinating theories that I've ever come across. I'm not saying it's right. I just think that it's absolutely compelling, and I think it deserves attention and consideration and discussion. And it's just been a real privilege to have you out here. And I'm so grateful that you finally decided to come out and explore these ideas casually like this.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Michael. Appreciate that. I just want to have a fair hearing among the scientific community, because I really think that I really think this to me is an open and shut case. I mean, we spent 2.5 hours talking about this, and there's still so much more evidence I could show you and talk about, and
And that's how the best conversations end, my friend. That's the best case scenario, right? You can never get to everything. There's just so many more questions, and I have so much more to think about in terms of all of this, but I think it is going to play out. That's the thing about really good ideas, is you just can't keep them buried forever. So, well,
I hope you're right.
Yeah.
But yeah, thank you so much for coming by today. This has been an absolute privilege for me, and
It's been really wonderful.
I look forward to just seeing what comes next. Maybe you'll blow my mind in new ways in the days to come.
Well, thank you very much.